On the very same day, the man who murdered George Floyd was sentenced to over 20 years in prison. We're learning the Trump White House was prepared to deploy active duty U.S. military to put down the protests in the streets last summer. That's according to new reporting from the New York Times today. Quote, responding to interest from President Trump, White House aides drafted a proclamation last year to invoke the Insurrection Act. Mr. Trump was talked out of the plan by three officials, those being Attorney General Bill Barr, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, and Joint Chiefs Chair Mark Milley. But a separate group of White House staff members wanted to leave open the option. Well, with us again tonight, Charlie Sykes, founder and editor-at-large at The Bulwark, author of the very relevant and successful book, How the Right Lost Its Mind. And here is Bill Kristol, author, writer, thinker, Politico, veteran of the Reagan and Bush administrations, editor-at-large over at The Bulwark. Gentlemen, good evening to you both. Charlie Sykes, I want to read you these quotes from the Michael Bender book upcoming from inside the West Wing. Quote, that's how you're supposed to handle these people, Trump told his top law enforcement and military officials. Crack their skulls. Trump also told his team that he wanted the military to go in and beat the F out of the civil rights protesters, Bender writes. Just shoot them, Trump said on multiple occasions inside the Oval Office, according to the excerpts. Well, Charlie, a couple things. Number one, this may account for the attack on General Milley, who had the presence of mind and the courage to stand up in that moment and say no. Number two, does this prove that with January 6th in mind, Trump isn't anti-protest, he's anti-certain people who protest?
No, it's also a reminder of how this country has so far dodged a bullet by not giving him a second term, and how grateful we should be to people like General Milley. Look, what we're seeing again is who Donald Trump was and how close this country came to real disaster. His will to power, his lust for violence, and his fantasies about using the military are on display there. And you have to wonder what he would have done had he not had restraining hands last year, and what he might do if he ever gets back into the presidency.
Bill Kristol, the Trump quotes indeed are Erdowinian, to coin a phrase, and enough to make Dick Daley of old blush. But then we move on to the attack on the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. While you've done nothing to deserve this, let's listen to what went out over the air last night.
He didn't get that job because he's brilliant or because he's brave or because the people who know him respect him. He is not, and they definitely don't. Milley got the job because he is obsequious. Hard to believe that man wears a uniform. He's that unimpressive. He's not just a pig, he's stupid.
Bill Kristol, did you think in your lifetime you'd live to see a day where the right was out to disfigure, denigrate, perhaps destroy the U.S. military?
I didn't, but been a lot of surprises, mostly very bad ones in the last few years. You know, just on that previous point on the Insurrection Act and those meetings at the beginning of June, well, June 1st, I guess, when General Milley and Secretary Esper did walk across Lafayette Square. They regretted that immediately, I think, with Trump when he went to St. John's Church and waved the Bible around. But I was thinking, as you read the account, there were three people in that room, right? Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, Bill Barr, Attorney General, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley. Trump fired Esper right after the election. Bill Barr quit on December 23rd, as I recall, not wanting to have to do certain things that Trump wanted him to do. I think that had so many disagreements. Barr couldn't stay there. I mean, I just come back. We discussed this a little bit before, but I just want to take this occasion to say people were really, really, really worried that last week or two of December and those first 2 or 3 weeks of January in the Pentagon. Serious people. I mean, and so Trump put in his loyalists there. I do think the uniformed military danced a very delicate dance of maintaining civilian control while making clear they would not obey unlawful orders. And the member Milley put out that statement. I think he sent it to all the troops, didn't he? Saying our loyalty is to the Constitution and to the law, not to individual people. I mean, the degree, how close we came to a genuine constitutional crisis, I think, is not fully appreciated today. And two of those three people who helped stop Trump from invoking the Insurrection Act on June 1st, they were gone by the last month of the presidency. So again, people at the time, thought we were too alarmed. And then the focus became January 6th, and that was terrible, fair enough. But people didn't really still quite see sometimes how much behind the scenes Trump was trying to do, and Trump loyalists in the White House were trying to do. Some of that has come out recently, too, obviously, with Mark Meadows, and how a few people did resist, including the uniformed military, in a pretty impressive way, I would say. And now, so they hate the conservative media, the Trump media. I hate to even use that word conservative. The Trump media hate that. They hate Milley, though Milley was a Trump appointee. At the time, some people were worried that he was too loyal to Trump. But he did stand up and do the right thing. He's standing up to Republicans in Congress now and defending the military's, various policies. And they just can't stand it.